Arcade Heroes.
Hey everyone, Adam with Arcade Heroes here, and I am back with another Arcade Memories, although maybe it's better to call it Arcade Obscurities or Arcade Rarities, as that's pretty much what I've focused on so far, and today is going to be no different, and that is this machine that you see behind me, Allied Tank Attack. Now, before I get into the game itself, I just wanted to cover the company that made this. They were known as InJoy Motion Corporation. I'll just call them InJoy, or maybe InJoy Motion. But as you can probably tell from that name, they were focused on motion gaming, motion simulators, for the most part. They did do a few things here and there that didn't exactly incorporate a lot of motion in them, but for the most part, that was their focus. And the first time that I come across them was in 2000, almost want to say 8, maybe 9, somewhere around there. When I went to my first trade show, I believe it was 2009, in Las Vegas, and just stumbled across this little booth that had these giant simulator machines. And as I recall, they had Panzer Elite Action, which had a very cool cabinet where you would sit inside of it and the screen would slide down in front of you, and then you would play this tank game. And then you also had Powerboat, which was a boat racing game that obviously was kind of influenced by Hydro Thunder, but yeah, it wasn't anywhere near as good as Hydro Thunder was. And I do have a video of this on my channel as well. As you can see, but one of the main issues that a lot of their earlier games had was the frame rate. It was just not very good, not very solid, not very high. And that was something they did improve on along with their game design as they went along. As I also recall, they had racing games like Street Racing Stars, which was trying to be kind of like Need for Speed, Carbon. They also had Dido Kart, as well as Dido Kart 2. I think they did well enough that that's one of the few games that they made a couple of sequels to. One of their final games was Kitty Dido, which was essentially the Dido Kart but made for kids, and was one of the earlier kind of kids racing games where you didn't need a foot pedal or anything like that to race. And they also had some light gun games such as Top Gunner and Project Xfer. And then they had unique stuff like this, Allied Tank Attack. I want to say that they stopped doing business around 2017, 2018 maybe, before the pandemic came along. Their last efforts, which I also have on my channel, were some VR concepts that didn't have a ton to do with motion, but the one thing that I did like about them is that they were innovative. They did try new ideas, and Allied Tank Attack is really one of those that kind of stood out a bit from what was available back in 2013 when this was released. And I think it was initially introduced in 2012. As it first was shown in this deluxe cabinet, which I don't have. That thing is enormous, as it came with a larger monitor, a 55-inch, and it had 2 seats, and the seat itself is motion-based, but one player had a yoke controller, which also that was something very unique for the time. It had been a long time since we'd seen any yoke-controlled games. And then the right side player would control a machine gun, and that had one of InJoy's specialized light guns. And now those light guns were very cool. They were mounted, so maybe not technically light guns, but they had a very unique force feedback system that was varied, and so it could mimic different types of cannons, and so whether it was a machine gun or blasting a cannon, and actually that same technology is used inside of the yoke on Allied Tank Attack. And so that was the initial machine released, and then shortly after they announced that one, they announced this more standard version, which still has a motion base to it and yoke controller, and it can also link with other ATA units, whether they're the deluxe ones or the single player ones, although I think they preferred that you kept the models the same across that if anybody tried that. Now, I'm not sure if anybody bought 4 units. I think that was the maximum we could link up to. Definitely do 2. I hadn't come across that, and that would make it interesting. But there's 3 modes in this game, and I did record these directly, but unfortunately, for some reason, the first video that I did, it did record the sound, and then the subsequent videos that I did, thinking that everything was fine with the sound, nothing came through. Nothing was recorded on the audio. So unfortunately, I won't be able to show all of those today. I'll just cut parts of these videos into it so you can see. So my apologies about that. And one of these other days when I have some extra time, I'll have to give it another shot, and hopefully it'll work that time. So I'm not very happy with AverMedia, the capture device that I have, because it keeps screwing up like this, and that wastes my time. Anyways, so it has 3 modes: story mode, battle mode, and survival mode. Story mode is pretty straightforward. It has a kind of a storyline to it, and so it's an oddball as far as the story goes. It's like an alternate history to World War II, and so you have the Allied forces and the Axis powers, but it doesn't say anything about Nazis or anything like that, and it doesn't show the swastika or anything. It's a skull instead, and there aren't any villains. It doesn't mention Hitler or any of the Mussolini or any of the other famous people that had been part of the Axis forces back in World War II, and so it's in that regard it's a little bit sanitized, but at the end of the day, most people don't play arcade games for the deep story or anything like that. But one thing that I should add is that the very first version of Allied Tank Attack wasn't very good. It had a lot of frame rate issues and some other gameplay issues, and I had bought this machine and brought it into my arcade, and after giving it some playthroughs, I sent InJoy some suggestions as to how to improve it, and I was pleasantly surprised that they took that to heart, and they didn't do everything that I suggested, as I'm sure it would have cost quite a bit to do things like adding some villain characters and voiceovers, but they did add voiceovers working with Bearing Games, and so the voices in this, there's 2 people that did voiceovers, and I know them. Cynthia was from InJoy Motion. She was the primary salesperson, and so that's the woman that's speaking in the attract mode, as well as I think Cindy is her name in the game, and then the guy you play is Greg Bakhorn. He's the CEO of Bearing Games. Bearing Games is the company that sold this in the United States, so I think it was Barron's first video game title, and so they also offered support, sales and support for that game. They did add those voiceovers, they improved the graphics, they sent out a new graphics card. The original one was just using a VGA cable, and they added DVI, so that helped the image quality a little bit, but also the new graphics card and some changes to the code also helped with the graphics overall, and so it's a lot more solid of a frame rate there, and just overall was a little better, and some other little tweaks made to the gameplay. Now, it's not perfect on gameplay, as you might see here. It's a little odd sometimes how things like any flying vehicle just kind of hangs in the same spot all the time, very unrealistic. But of course, this is an arcade game. It's not meant to be super realistic. You're just wanting to drive a tank and blow stuff up, and it does that pretty well. And so with the story mode, there's 2 routes with 5 missions each, and so I did do a full playthrough of the first route, and so it sucks that it didn't keep any of the audio there, but the other thing that was a little bit surprised by, just because you're not accustomed to it, to swearing in arcade games. I mean, it still happens once in a while, but that did surprise me a little bit. Yeah, so generally you just, as you go through the story mode, you go from one point to another. It does have a green arrow on there to show you what direction you're supposed to go. There's plenty of health and ammo pickups. Like, I've never got anywhere close to having not enough ammunition available, and so yeah, no problems there. Maybe it was a little too much on their end, but you'll like destroy a target and it'll do this odd thing like there's a force field or something in place. There is part in the attract mode, it mentioned something about phantom power, which gave the Axis forces benefit in the war and turned the tide of the war, although it isn't very clear what it is, and almost makes it sound like it's robotic power or something like that, but it has something to do with force fields. It's not fully explained, but whatever, it's okay. Not everything needs to be explained, I guess. But yeah, so you just go destroy targets, kind of hitting checkpoints. It adds a little time to the timer, and then you move on to the next objective, and usually you end up fighting a boss. And I think all of the missions, except for one, really have a boss. Like the mission 1.4, 1-4, you're just fighting a building. It calls it a boss, but it's not really a boss. You just shoot a building a lot of times, and there are turrets around it and other tanks and jeeps and things, but it doesn't feel quite like a boss fight. But yeah, I could have used with some more personality as far as, like I said, villains would have helped it out. And the very end of the game is also just a little odd. You don't get to attack the Axis headquarters, which is a giant skull in a mountain. You just watch a little quick cutscene showing the Allies blowing it up. But, you know, overall, like I said, the main point of this game is to just drive around, shoot stuff, blow things up, and it does that really well. And one thing that was innovative on Allied Tank Attack, other than it being the first tank game that we had seen in a long time, was the use of an air compressor and a new air bladder system that InJoy had developed. And they were the ones that, as far as I know, originated with this, because prior to that, any motion system was either hydraulic based or electrical motor based, and they were extremely expensive. So most of your motion games started at something like $30,000 and would go up from there. And so Sega did plenty of those in the 2000s and also in the 2010s. Well, maybe not plenty, but they did a few. And they just tended to be very, very pricey. And so InJoy came up with this rubber bladder system, and that used an air compressor to move the seat around and also do force feedback in things like the yoke controller. And that was another thing with Allied Tank Attack. It came with a yoke controller. And that was just something we hadn't really seen much other than with Atari Star Wars and a few other games here and there in the 80s and maybe a couple in the 90s, but it just wasn't very, very common for a control scheme. And so that was another cool thing. But with my unit right now, its current condition isn't the best. I do need to fix it up. I realized as I was playing it that it seems like one of the air bladders might not be connected anymore or is damaged, and so probably needs to be replaced. Also got to fix a couple of things on the controls, as one of the triggers isn't working, and there's also something odd with the pedals where it wasn't stopping. It was just constantly moving forward, or when you push the forward pedal, it would move you backwards, so got to fix that. But anyways, so yeah, you have story mode, which I've been showing here as I've been talking, and then there was also battle mode. Now, battle mode was made primarily for linked units, so that two people could face off against each other and go and blow up the other one's base. Now, it does work in single player mode, as you see here, as you just fight off an AI and you try and do as much damage as you can to their base or blow up their base before the timer runs out. And so pretty straightforward on that, and it has multiple levels that you can choose from. And then finally we have survival mode, which is just a you're in a large open field with hills around, and there's tons of enemies that just spawn. Eventually bosses spawn, and you just see how long you can survive. But of course you can keep going, and so if you put in coins, if your time runs out, then, or you lose too many lives, you can still go. And so it's kind of a pay to survive sort of setup, but if you just want to shoot stuff or test things out, that's what you can do. And that's another nice thing to this, is it does have a bunch of different tanks to choose from. So you have your base tank, which you have like light, heavy, medium assault. I think there's 2 others. And then you have a variety of weapons to choose from, anywhere from a machine gun mount to rockets, or like there's a single rocket, there's the Melvin turret, which I used in the story mode, which fires a bunch of rockets at enemies. There's a sniper attachment, flamethrower attachment, and so there's a variety there. And so whichever one you pick, that's what becomes your main trigger weapon. And then there's every single turret has a little machine gun on it that you can access with your thumbs, but that doesn't do a lot of damage, to be honest. So overall, I mean, this one, while it was produced by a corporation, and I'm not sure how many units are out there, but there should be a few, maybe 100 or so, or 200, not sure. It kind of feels like an indie game in some respects, but it wasn't. So it's one of those ones in limbo, I guess you could call it. But overall, unique game. Said it's fun for blowing stuff up, and in a way it's kind of competing with Blazing Angels, even though it came out a few years or several years after Blazing Angels did. But I have both Blazing Angels and Allied Tank Attack here, and they've both done about the same over the years. Now, my Allied Tank Attack will probably do a little better once I get some of those little issues fixed, so that people will want to come back to it. But one thing that I do like about it is, I mean, it does have a lot of content. It is a little bit open world. I mean, yeah, it's a cool game. So if you do come across it out there, give it a spin. Don't know if it'll be your favorite. Usually what I find is younger kids really get into it, since it's kind of like an interactive kiddie ride. But since it has enough content to it, that makes it kind of cool. And it's too bad we'll probably never get a sequel that can improve on some of the negative aspects or downfalls of it, such as how the helicopters move and things of that nature. But that's Allied Tank Attack. So again, my apologies that I was not able to get the sound captured on all of the levels. And so again, I'll have to come back to that one of these other days and just throw it up on the channel. But I hopefully also soon will have some newer stuff to show. But until then, hope you enjoyed this look at Allied Tank Attack and a trip down memory lane for InJoy Motion. And we'll catch you on the next video, whatever that happens to be.